Welcome to Primordial Tao, Present Tao, a podcast about all things Taoism.
Welcome to Primordial Tao, Present Tao. This is episode 19, Bi Gu, Metabolic and Spiritual Fasting. Dr. Mike's in the house.
Yo, Ravi, what's the hap, dude?
What's going on?
Apparently, time, gravity, and some kind of field event they call the universe.
Are we talking about quantum fields already to get this podcast started?
Why not start with the biggest abstractions of all? Because this is going to get down to the kind of short and curly bits of life, because fasting can be hard.
Can be hard. And on that note, I'm actually in the middle of a fast right now. Yeah.
Woohoo! How long you
How
going
many
for?
hours in? 72 hours, and I'm
Nice.
27 hours in.
Deep bow of respect, man.
Thank you. Well, if you tune into last week, I was kind of going through some stuff. So this is kind of the repair project for
Right.
what happened last week. Um,
How's that all going?
anyways, pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah. Yeah,
Nice.
it's been a very interesting week, but I'm finding my way out of it and I'm coming back to balance and fasting's a big part of that from my understanding.
It's definitely the black belt level of, especially for modern life. It's I don't know, it's like you see the memes a lot, or maybe I just get certain memes because of what I'm interested in. But there's always some person crawling up the mountain to find the ancient hermit wisdom master, and they ask them some really big ass fancy question, and they say, "Oh, just eat, three meal or one meal a day," or that they'll say something about, presence or something. And it's always like a bit of a joke, like you work your butt off to go and find this big thing, and then it's like the simplest thing. Fasting in a way is like the journey up that hill. Like the truth of fasting in a way is so simple, multifaceted, but it's like climbing up that mountain with your clothes being torn apart because a part of you that wants clothes or wants comfort is just like, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, big thing you said there. Usually we look for this big thing, but it's simple.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not, I don't think most people are disappointed by that, but I think there is a part of us in the modern world that, things are complicated. We want a complicated truth.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my complicated mind would love a complicated truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we can start there sometimes just to like feel anchored in, like, I don't know. Yeah, I could come up with a metaphor, but that doesn't really matter. Less complicated, more truth. But sometimes it's
Anyways,
good to start with I don't know, all the pieces on the floor.
yeah, no doubt. So welcome our listeners, friends and family. We're gonna get into some fasting today. And hey, Mike, we've actually been trying to do this podcast for a while, so I'm really excited to get into this because I feel like there's quite a few different strands that we could go, different
Mhm.
directions. And I'm super curious in all this because not only is it very important, it's also really practical.
Yeah,
So it's kind of all of the things, and I think there's something in here for just about everyone,
for sure. Absolutely.
as opposed to some of the like Taoist alchemy stuff, which is very niche.
Hey, you got 30 years, a couple hours a day.
So normally when we do this, Mike, you usually start off by breaking down the character. Is that how we want to get this conversation started today, or do you have a better idea?
I mean, let's see how that goes. I don't think the context of fasting is vague in any way. So I think starting with from the Taoist, because it's Taoist podcasts and everything, the context and meaning of the characters sometimes I think almost like watching Game of Thrones or something, like it transports us into the world in which people drew their sense of meaning, like the way Chinese characters are drawn. I mean, it could be in Egyptian hieroglyphs, it could be in old Greek. I'm not suggesting it's only true in Chinese, but and I'm saying that right now, and I think I've said this before because I want to invite people back, and I feel like I should be like telling a children's story. Back in the day, young ones, come and follow me into the mystery of our ancient beginnings. So if we go back to the maybe the first people who chose to not eat instead of had to eat tree bark or not eat.
Mm.
Because I mean, fasting or a lack of food and calories has been a part of our evolution since vertebrates kind of came out of the ocean. So on a species level, on an evolutionary level, we have this capacity to not die if we don't eat for a couple of months, assuming you're, fit and healthy.
Couple months, hey, that's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, people. I mean, there's one guy who made it 300 and I think 86 days or something. So we have the capacity in the sense of how we store energy and can actually maintain our relative health without food. So the distinction I'm making is we can fast. We have evolved to being able to fast and go through famine. Famine, I think, is a very different emotional, spiritual context than I'm going to decide not to eat for a few days to clarify my mind, to sacrifice my convenience or comfort in some way. So I just want to make that distinction at the beginning that who was the first person to like actually decide, like, what I really think I should do is famining, right?
Right.
Because
Sounds like a crazy concept.
Well, it just shifts our paradigm a little bit because like who was the first person who finally after agriculture and storehouses of food and maybe even merchants that you could go and trade something for more you could be the little waif kid hiding in the proverbial back alley of some village to like grab the piece of bread that falls off the cart, whatever. So I guess I'm just trying to play out the context of our need for food, and then being one of the first people to have availability to food, and then recognize that this kind of oversaturated sponge experience of just anytime I want, I can absorb more, I can get more, I can have more. What would it be like to not have more? So there's that thing to just bring up, and I think in the sense of who am I without instead who am I with more? Because you have to have lived in a saturated sponge life to find meaning in, oh, what would be interesting is a little bit less of more, a little bit less of all, a little bit, uh, maybe self-restraint even in the just basic sense. Because it's always interesting to go back. Like it was usually the well-read intellectual who actually says, you know what would be interesting to try something inconvenient,
Hmm.
you know.
So,
And
so
and
from your perspective, who was the first one?
Uh, I guess I'm just framing that in the context of a culture with language, because we're going to go into previous, like long, long time ago, rites of passage and other things. But because we're talking about characters, so it's like some person in their library sitting down going, let's establish a really foundational relationship with this, given certain experiences. And the context is an excess of grains. So be cool. I'll come back to just sort of sense let's just say take a break. Or there's more to it than that, but let's just say take a break. And the character cool often just translated as grains, sometimes as meaning kind of the more starchy or damp or sugar-filled uh, uh, range of foods that we have. But if you go back to the earliest first classic carrier, which is kind of my thing, is like well, who's the first person to actually put this idea down in characters? It specifically means non hulled grains, grains that haven't been thrashed, and the bran and the germ is still there, right?
Hmm.
So the telling thing here is they were eating whole grains, as we seem to continue to aspire to do as a good idea, and recognizing that the hulled grains are less damaging in the long term for longevity than the whole grains. right? So there's an interesting context in Taoist practice, which is an abstinence from grains, which is one way people say biku. You just in the context of longevity, eat everything you want as much as you want, just don't eat the grains, especially the whole grains. And for anyone listening who eats whole grain bread, and I've eaten more than my share of loaves of whole grain bread when I was eating bread in my life, because I thought they were better for me before I, went through, say, training in functional medicine and stuff. So what's the difference between, like, say, white rice and brown rice? Because that's the context in one sense. So when we look at long-term human health, less starch or less carbohydrates is a good idea.
Hmm.
Whole grains with the bran and the germ and all the extra bits that are, right off the plant, you could say, contain more nutrients. So what's going on? It turns out that the shell part of whole grains contains a lot of extra nutrients, but it also contains a lot of anti-nutrients. And I'm not going to go into all the details. You can go on my clinic website called allthingsautoimmunity.com, and I break down all the anti-nutrients and why they're bad for you, because your immune system is right up against the small intestine, and the anti-nutrients in grains basically stab your immune system and your gut lining in the proverbial eye or other tender places, because plant babies, plant embryos, or grains with the intact hull are designed to protect themselves from the digestive system of mammals like you and I, or cows and chipmunks and everything else. So that hull is an evolutionary capacity to get the plant babies through our digestive systems so they can grow up in our poop. So when we think of whole grains, it's important to go, oh, that's got more ching in a way, but it's also got more wei qi. It has a way for itself to protect itself so that it can maintain its evolutionary capacity to grow up in the poop of animals. So way, way back 3,000 years ago, the agricultural culture of the time had come to that kind of end of benefit of just eating the five classic grains of Chinese medicine and Chinese culture. Um, Eating them intact seems to be less beneficial than the people who eat the ones that are hulled because they live a bit longer.
Mm.
Right? They die sooner than people who don't eat grains at all. But it's like if you were like the first statistician going, okay, there's a village over here that only eats, whole grains because they're, still farming right off the land, and, pigs live in their house, which is a sort of a Chinese term for a certain kind of home, but a certain kind of village culture, like the romantic culture, of ancient village. And then you have, say, bigger city culture where the older people who don't want to chew the hard to chew grains can now afford the whole grains. And they actually obviously can live longer because they can keep eating. But when they get older, they're more likely to have lost their teeth, lost their hair, lost their memories, lost a bunch of other things, because they're, you could say, moving in the direction from a modern context of being pre-diabetic, catabolic, chronically inflamed, moving towards Alzheimer's. Right? So we have this. There's people who live in Village A. And for some reason, I'm thinking of the movie The Princess Bride, because the village in that would have been perfect because there was animals everywhere. Still living like hand to mouth. And then we have city people. They're doing their best, but the rich people can have hulled grains because they have servants who can, beat up the grains until the hulls fall off. And then we have, say, Village C, the mountain village, where people don't eat grains at all because they don't do agriculture. They just live off herding animals, wild gathered, say squash and beans and other things that they don't have to fight rabbits against to thrive. They just have what's called passive agronomy. They just live like indigenous people do everywhere who have picked up herding, right? And that's a huge part of Chinese history is that time of herding and gradually developing that passive kind of agronomy. Grains just take a lot of work. You have to fight off the deer, you have to fight off the rabbits. I don't know if you've ever tried. I mean, you literally live in an orchard, so
Yeah.
I don't know how much deer fencing you guys have, but every time I
Well, we
would
have
try.
bears that are eating everything.
Right. So I mean, well, like I've done some permaculture stuff in the past with farming and stuff. And if you don't have a 9-10 foot fence, the animals will come and eat your food, right? So anyway,
Mm.
I'm just playing out that for the listeners to be able to go, okay, Non-hulled grains, more nutrient dense, but people die younger. Hulled grains, less nutrient dense, but less anti-nutrients. People live longer, but they die like modern people do of a certain class of diseases, just not as soon. Plus and minus. You look at the proverbial Shen, the people living in the villages and the mountains that aren't really agricultural yet. Taoism uses that character to describe immortality because those people still seem to live in some mythically connected to the world, with less fear and clutching. Because in Taoism, if you have something you can't live without, now you live in fear of protecting it. You know, the old adage, if you have to have a lock on your door, your life is now about, fear.
Mm,
So lots of metaphor there. But when you look at the people living in the just the herding passive agronomy villages, they live the longest. They have the healthiest lives. They have the biggest smiles. They still have all their teeth in their biggest smiles and everything because they haven't gone down the road of living off, intense carbohydrate containing foods. So back to the characters and the first person to make this distinction, who would be writing this down in the intellectual linguistic sense of what should we call this? The abstinence from grains that are unhulled.
okay.
Also, depending on where you're at in Taoist practice, you may want to align yourself more with choosing a diet that's an abstinence from grains completely, because it kind of implies that too. But it speaks to something that's a transition from, say, 5,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago, as they discovered whole grains great, whole grains better, but also bad. Maybe this whole grain thing is a bad idea. And if anyone who's listening is in any way connected to the autoimmune world in the last 20 years, paleo diets, keto diets, low carb diets, this kind of diets, turns out grains are just like a problem if you eat them all day, every day. Right. So
Right.
that's that context of abstinence. Now, when you kind of get into that character of B, and it kind of goes two different ways when you look into the earlier characters, because one has to do with sort of the governmental authority restriction of behavior, right? So let's say maybe the modern context of if you're going to fast, you should do it right or you're a bad faster. Because there's an element to spiritual practice that's relatively modern in the sense of do good things or you're bad. So there's a B, cool, right? B can have a character that's often even pronounced P, which is this governmental thing about obey and that's a big part of Confucian Chinese culture too, is we set up a sequence of things that we do just right. And if you do them just right, but not completely right, you did something wrong. And now the intentional part, the overarching governance part, and I mean, we could go into all kinds of parts of how our mind works around that, would be dissatisfied with your outcome because you didn't do it in the ethical humility, obeisance, not obesity, but obeisance, like to obey, right? So that's one character. But if you dig around, as people like me like to dig around, there's this other old character for B, not P, that means to ward off evil spirits with a talisman, an amulet, or a coherent practice. Like
Nice.
singing, like to sing the demons out of your hovel, your hut, your house, because it brings us back to the shaman time, that now this abstinence doesn't mean abstain from the glory of the feast of agriculture. It brings us back to the experience of I'm now doing something to coherently maintain an ethos, a relationship, um, the opposite of comforting, the opposite of easy, the opposite of being the child being cared for by the spirits. I now have to stand next to the guardian spirits and hold up my talisman, sing my song, and abstain from the comforting things to show my potency against this fear I project onto the potency of the evil spirits, the things I'm warding off. So, do you ever
Wow.
play Dungeons and Dragons or video games
No, I
with
haven't.
Dragons and Magicians? So, my son used to play a video game, I think called Skyrim, which was really cool to see. And he tried being a magician, and there was a thing because we had this rule in our house that if you're playing video games, you have to do it with people. You couldn't just go into a room by yourself and disappear. So I'd sit on the couch next to him and, you know, feel like a sports announcer. Oh, good job. But he had this thing called a ward, which was like a kind of spell that apparently is a big part of all the games that have to do with magic, is you create a ward. And I think people still do that. We think of maybe Wei Qi in the context of process shamanism and Qigong. Can I create a better shield? Right? So when we ward something off, we extend a kind of like yeah, I think of like a glowing sphere of light that starts like around you like a bit of clothing, and then it inflates like a balloon, and then maybe it goes out to the end of the street or the end of the township you're in, or maybe it extends in time, past and future, to protect you and your ancestors from something that's haunting you. Because when you get into the spirit world and all the deities and gods and sub-gods and demons and stuff, there's thousands in Chinese culture. Like there was a period of time when the richest person was the shamans running around dealing with all of the different gods in your life, your house, your family, and the grave sites and the feng shui and everything. Like there's actually a book, I can't remember exactly the title, but it was like an overcrowding of spirits and in the end of a certain part of Chinese culture. Also, just to throw this out for people who do Qigong and Tai Chi Chuan or Tai Chi, ward off is one of the primary things you do when you touch someone, which we call peng qin, which is a quality of occupying space into their structure to make them push back, to keep you from pushing them over. And as soon as they push back, you have more mechanical awareness of their alignment. So now you can play with them because you know more about how sensitivity and push hands works as a practice. Right. And it's meant to be kind of a playful dueling with peers. It's not meant to be fighting. But the first thing you learn in Tai Chi, in the sense of practice with other people around martial arts, is called ward off. So I'm not going to try and I'm not going through every possible, use of the expression, but Bi Gu means something in the spirit world or in our spiritual practice or in our spiritual autonomy and authenticity. Because if you can't hold something at bay, including your desire for comfort and ease and stimulation and satisfaction, and nowadays say the whole dopamine, frenzy cascades and stuff like that, you're a person who needs someone else to do that for you. So imagine you're 10 years into meditation and you're recognizing that you actually have to be the one who decides your egoic needs are no longer you. Can you sit and know of the other components of self, non-egoic components of self, that you can hold that space in the sacred way to keep your egoic need to be, what we call nowadays confirmation bias. I'm a self. I need to be met as a self. Someone should like me as a self, and I'm a good self, and all of that. That's really important in the way we interact with people as social beings. You have to have a satisfactory self to be satisfied with yourself as a person, identity, ego. But if you're going to go into meditation for where that's meant to go, you kind of have two lives now. You have the life where you talk to your family and, I don't know, chat with your parents next to the sink while you're doing dishes. And your parents want you to be a good you, so you give them a sense of the signaling that we do. Yay, let me tell you a story about myself, doing things that prove myself to be growing as a self. And the parents nod and go, oh, good self, and tap, pat, pat on the head. And your ego is like, and I'm not mocking that. I'm saying if you don't do that stuff, you're even worse off because you haven't satisfied the need to complete the selfing. Which we talked a little bit about in the last episode, and probably for the next 5 as we get into kind of the psychology of Taoist practice. But in meditation, we're in this opposite, dynamic, which is I don't need to be a separate self anymore. How do I ward off the egoic self? Wait a minute. How does a different component of me and as existence develop a sense of quiescence, calm, patience, and peace with a self knocking at the back of your door of consciousness all the time, going, let me back in. I'm the reason it's all happening. It's me, me, me. And you're just like, we develop that capacity through meditation, but we develop it in a kind of almost like doing push-ups way by fasting.
Nice.
Now, I just want to
Yeah.
take a little, before we dive into the next thing, I just want to take one small leap back a couple of thousand years because we don't want to, dishonor the ancestors. Isn't it interesting that every indigenous culture, every early spiritual text, ethos, practice, early religions, pretty much the big thing you do once in a while is fast. Almost always during what we call the hungry time, spring, late winter. I'm not well read on every spiritual tradition in the world. I'm, just a very few. So uh, I can't speak as a scholar of religion, so I don't have the names of every tradition's approach to fasting in my mind, and maybe you have a few in your mind. But interesting that that's the thing. And given I have a First Nations background and, sometimes teach Aboriginal education and spend time with people from other nations and tribes and things and hear about their approaches. And I'm just going to speak to a couple of things quickly because we have some misunderstandings in common culture about them. Um, there's this thing called vision questing that Western culture has adopted as sort of a ripoff, especially of the plains people of Canada and the US, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Blood, Perren, other cultures that live in that area. I think because Hollywood sort of just like filmed them as the last sort of, regal romantic Indian or kind of a thing like that. So there's a thing they call, well, that in that language it's called hambleichea. Hambleichea means to cry all night, like in a
To what? Sorry?
sacred, to cry all night.
Cry all night.
Hambleichea. So ha is to go into darkness. Ble, 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 ble is to cry. Tsea is like in the way of prayer to honor the sacred, to invite ancestors and other beings to kind of hold the practice with you in that way. Because there's the indigenous context is everything is anima, right? So there isn't a separate component of me and others in the same way we see it now. So when I'm in Han Bleiche, and the first way that usually goes is when you're 10, 11, 12, and it's time for you to stop maybe deciding to individuate in a way that's harmful. Because kids get picky and then they get fidgety and then they get, pardon me for saying bitchy, or, we act out against our parents to figure out boundaries. And that, happens at the very beginning of adolescence. And then it gets worse, and then it gets worse, and then it gets worse, and then you have a big blowout with your family, and then you slam the door and get in your, cheap car because you're 16, and at least in Canada, and you just drive away with the big plume of smoke because of, fish shaking in the sky, because that's how we disengage the child parent connection in modern life. That doesn't happen in previous cultures because there's no car, there's nowhere to go, and you can't just go and off be a petulant teenager the rest of your life because people actually need you to show up. So there's a
Yeah.
strategy, and then I'm using the instead of the culture I come from, that one because it's the one that we in the West steal for, misunderstand, misinterpret, try and make up and do weird stuff with, and the damage from that is worth speaking to. So imagine you're 12. And this is actually what used to happen in many cultures, not just Plains culture, is the grandmothers, grandfathers, uncles, depending on who you need to have a sit down with, context is important. They would paint charcoal under your eyes. And then they would go and walk you away from whatever you would be living in, some kind of hut. This is, let's just say up to even like 8,000 years ago or something, just to pick a number. And they walk you away from the hut until the grandmother would feel you clutching their hand, because children will be like, getting nervous because they know they're going to be left out all night. And maybe they can see a fire and they can see someone sitting there. When I did this with my son the first time, different context because we're in Lakota, he wanted to do it really young because he used to come with me to different reserves when I was talking and stuff. And he was like, Dad, I want to do that. I want to do that. So I had this, little sort of situation set up, and he went to go and sort of crash in a tent in the backyard. But that was his first chance. He was 5 or 6, so I was like the tears of pride in my son. He wants to go and prove his capacity. Anyway, so when you walk someone away from the witness holding the space, you'll feel the child signal in some way that that's now they're getting scared. So you just want to take a few more steps until they're like scared. And you say, this is your spot. And then they're not like way off in the middle of nowhere. They can, it's like imagine you're sitting in your backyard staring at the, I don't know, light of the TV coming through the window or something. I don't know. So it's you're not way off there. And they want to just leave you there alone as a child, vulnerable and scared. Not because it's abuse, although nowadays you would probably go to jail. It's because you wanted them to come and see you after sunrise with all of the charcoal, um, the lines of your tears seen through the charcoal dribbling down your face. Now, again, people will think that's so mean. How else can you prove to a primitive, viscerally alive, non-domesticated human being that being alone is not the solution? Being a jerk and self-involved and, picky or whatever is not the solution. To be alone is death in these cultures. So we start 10, 11, 12 with little incremental things of, remember that night you sat shivering, weeping because you thought it was fine that you could just not behave in a culturally, ethically, collaboratively important survival way. Because as young people, we say, I don't want to do that. Screw you, mom and dad. I'm going to go and join the circus. Back then there was no circus. There was, go solo and die or be a part of your tribe. So as kids get a little older, it's now 4 days on the side of a hill, no water, no food, after sweat lodges, after other things, after maybe an initiation time. And, you might get a name afterwards that suggests you're more than just a child, which is kind of important because now you realize your only place to become whole and become competitively relevant and to find out what you're really made of and what you can really give back is to really find out what you're made of. So all cultures have these opportunities that say, find out who you are and bring that one back to us so you can be one of us. And I know I've said this on this podcast before, we don't have a word for I or me. We have a term that implies this one of.
Beautiful.
So sometimes we have to go and find out which this one we are so we can come back with a kind of potency of selfing, but from our own sense of autonomy. I know who I am because I have this vision, I have this understanding, I have this need, I have a knowing. You come back to the next sweat after your 4 days up on the hill, you tell the story, you sit, the elders and choir keepers and all the other people around that, very ancient ceremony, which again is done many different ways around the world. Maybe spend some time considering what you experienced, and then they might offer you a different name that honors who you're here to be as an autonomous self that only really means anything in the collaborative will of your people. Right? I think we all remember that in some way because that's like, what is it? 98% of human evolution is hunter-gatherer time. We have like 2% race memory of, oh yeah, I should probably accumulate resources and put them in a room and lock it somehow. As above, so below. So nowadays we build an identity that no one else gets to have an influence on. I'm a locked door. Look at me go. I can get in my car and drive away. I can run away from home. I could actually go and join the circus. You know, so we're made of something and we have needs that we don't really remember why. And because modern life gives us this sort of eject, I think of that little cord you pull in a parachute to like, I don't want to fall through space and wait and find out what my parents turned me into. I want my own parachute. I want to go and find myself in my own way. And that's new. I'm not saying that's wrong, it's just new. And unfortunately, the way we do it nowadays is usually to make our ego bigger instead of becoming more
Yeah.
humble, right? And that's a bit of a crisis for some people, which they'll run into in their 30s and 40s when they realize I still don't know who I am because I've never had to hold myself within a space of discomfort and stillness and patience. Because I can go out there and do a thing that in 5 minutes, like I'll go pick a fight in a bar with somebody. Now I'm a guy who's a bar fighter. There's so many ways we can go and risk that. And I don't know how far I can take this, but the ways men and women, young men and women, go and find out what boundaries are made of are very, very different. And they're often, unfortunately, very, very crushing to our sense of self,
Mm.
right? So we
Yeah,
don't
it
need to
seems
go
like
too
all
far
these
away.
ways it seems like all these ways in our like modern world um that we go and gain our independence in quotation marks, they're just ways to like you said, make the ego bigger. So it's
Mhm.
like you're instead of I guess becoming this one of and having humility, it's like the vision in my mind is like just like throwing up the middle fingers to like your family and like going out in your car, just like I'm gonna go and do this thing.
Mhm.
And it's funny because I've been trapped in that paradigm actually a lot of like needing to go out there and I guess essentially like prove myself to be somebody in my family.
Mhm. Yeah. So if we can ward off all of the things that separate us from the spiritual warrior within, maybe that'd be a better name for the book. Meeting your spiritual warrior from within or something. I don't know. Anyway, that's not something we have in our culture that holds a lot of meaning unless you've already gone to Burning Man, gone to I don't know, the orgies, gone to the big cities, gone to the places where it's the biggest, loudest, most potentially insane version of boundary pushing against limits. How big, how much, how loud, how like I don't know if you've been to Burning Man, but like, okay, let's, create this, situation that offers that kind of an experience for people. And I'm not dissing Burning Man. I'm just saying, okay, that's about as far out there as you can get. Cool. What's the farthest in there you can get? It's still meant to be a transitional rite of passage, something that reforms, transforms. And
Hmm.
now we come back to, well, I think, I mean, I've done a lot of medically supervised fasting. I think the average age is late 20s into the 60s.
Wow.
But yeah, 35 to 45. There's a thing in most people that are like, why? I mean, that's not like, I mean, it could be 30 to 50, but somewhere in that range is when a lot of people are called from within to know themselves from within. What you keep finding out there, what you're looking for isn't actually out there. And you come to that somewhat disappointing. Sometimes people come in very depressed, like I've tried everything to create the conditions to know that I am a whole self in some way.
Yeah, yeah, I've been knocking on all of those doors for sure.
So we can get some things figured out. Um, going to places and ashrams and Burning Mans and ayahuasca retreats and all the other things, but sitting alone in a room or outside for days with or without water, that's no that's like a treasure map home. It's just full of all the trolls and monsters of convenience conditioning, comfort conditioning, right? Self-gratification conditioning. I mean, we're not even the same species since the internet showed up. Like where we truly are cyborgs in that context, that we live in a virtual and a tangible world.
Yeah, just to share a bit of a personal experience, just from if you, I keep referring to that last podcast, but it's funny because I went on this big dopamine binge, and coming down from that, it's interesting because caffeine, easy, sugar, easy, all the rest of the stuff, even fasting, relatively easy. The phone. Oh my God, man. The phone. Like I even today I found myself picking up and oh my God, I'm scrolling, I'm 2 videos deep and noticing all the gratification and everything that it does to kind of like I guess highlight my ego and all of the different, I guess, judgments.
Hmm.
Um, it's absolutely fascinating what I'm learning in these last few days about like I kind of just I don't want this anymore.
Yeah, well, it's always going to be there. Just
It's gonna
like,
be there, yeah.
yeah, luring us in.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
2024 demon, the phone, the
Yeah.
scrolling, the videos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh. Yeah, anyways. So I guess this is a good transition into um because we do have our fasting. Actually, I think we already talked about stimulation addiction in a sense.
Hmm.
Mm, physiology? Should we do physiology next? Or do you want
Well, I mean, we can go anywhere. You had something you were thinking of that had to do with a personal experience. Wasn't sure if you wanted to get into that, but what
yeah, we
other
can get into
experiences
that.
with fasting or other experiences with the opposite of fasting? And maybe I could share my experience with fasting a bit.
Um yeah, we can get into that. I'm just trying to figure out how to word that question. So the question's around sex and sexuality, and on some level, there's lots of gratification, and sex can be kind of like a rabbit hole into really building that egoic self. So how would we balance something like, exploring our sexuality, being in a paradigm like a self or an internal cultivation path and kind of bridging those two gaps and putting them together? Because the way I'm sitting right now, it almost seems like that sex would just lead me into um, almost the opposite direction.
Hmm.
But there's probably something I'm missing here in context.
Well, there's a lot of different kinds of fasting. I mean, in Taoist practice, we have bigu in the sense of, less grains, less whole grains, or no food, depending on the context of what it is and why you want to remove something, from your diet or from your experience. We have mind fasting, right? There's abstinence from sex. There's abstinence from, you could pick anything, an abstinence is from, I wish there was an abstinence from going to work on Tuesdays or something like. So the idea of abstinence, avoid, ward off, isn't because the other thing is bad. Like to say fasting means food is bad is just a really weird thing to decide. Food's bad. Instead of a period of time of restraint and reflection is good.
Hmm.
So when it comes to, say, sex and intimacy and some of the, especially nowadays with the internet, some of the confounds about getting what you want from someone or taking something or getting, like, there's an advantage game that we sometimes play out with each other and ourselves. And when we get into inner cultivation of any kind, and you've been kind of going on a deep dive for a few years now, and well done.
Thank you.
Um, the sense environment that we come into is very new and very full and very fulfilling and very affirming that by moving consciousness and behavior and things in certain ways is in a way that spiritual warrior, but we're at first learning the benefits of practice. Just like if you wanted to get stronger and you go to the gym for a few months, you're going to get stronger.
Hmm.
Right? Sometimes being patient or being sensually willing as I kind of make up words to share that context of, well, now that I'm actually interested in my what you might call interoception, nociception, other aspects of perception that inform us of our experience of life. You know, kind of like sunglasses change the hue of the world. So we have a lot of inner sense that's just below the mind, telling the mind what to expect. So let's say at a very anxious childhood, you're going to wander around as an adult with a very anxious sense of the world. You learn a practice that helps you go below the anxiety and have different senses of self, different senses of what senses can be and mean. Now you're a person who can now operate in the world with less anxiety, right?
Hmm.
So what often happens, and I know that's common sense, what often happens is when we start getting into that inner sense world and we start transforming our sense of self in the world, not just our inner world, we can perhaps make a slightly, very natural, but slightly, what else can I get frame. So if maybe I'm going to do Qigong 1, 2, 4 hours a day, or meditate, or breath work, it depends on what you're learning. Now I'm now I'm succeeding at changing the baseline of my sense experience. There's nothing more profound than changing the ground of being, which is what these practices exist all over the world in different ways. Once I get into that, there's a part of me that naturally wants more and some control because I should lock the door because I have something of value. So I should
Hmm.
probably abstain from all the things I enjoy, if it's caffeine, alcohol, cannabis, things like that, sex, I don't know, whatever else is on the internet that might be, I don't know, conspiracy theories or something, like anything that's compelling. We just start realizing the opposite of compelling is fulfilling, because compelling behavior drains us. At
Yes.
some point, though, at least in my experience, and the pendulum has to be able to go back and forth, we can lock the door, which is a pretty interesting thing given how Taoism says, oops, if you're locking the door, you're attached to the sense that what you have is fragile, impermanent, and someone else might want to take it away from you or could possibly take it away from you, including yourself. Like, oh my God, I finally got some inner peace. I'll probably screw that up. Because obviously inner peace isn't a bauble you can inherit from your grandma and stuff, in your back of your closet between your, I don't know, dirtiest underwear to hope that if the robber that you're afraid of is going to not steal it, right? So anyway, just saying, like, notice the craving controlling mind is a little nightmare. But we can also decide, wow, look at my footprints in the sand. My footprints in the sand have gone deep enough into the surf to disappear into something that we're going to call oceaning, which is like selfing, but not making more of. It's just returning to something innate.
Hmm.
At any time in life, those footprints in the proverbial sand of practice and consciousness and memory are still there. Sure, the ocean's washed away a few of them as the tide comes in because sex, because alcohol, because cannabis, because distraction, because I don't know, we went to my partner's family thing for Thanksgiving in Canada, which was a couple of weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago or something, and all of the stuff, right? So there's me sitting there being like, okay, how far do I go with all of the stuff to introduce myself to this, my amazing partner. You want to put, even in the middle of your life, you still want to impress the family, right? So, okay, I'll have some champagne or whatever. That doesn't mean the ocean has destroyed the footprints in the sand. It just means the surf got a little big for 10 hours as you chemically deal with something you really don't want in your body. But notice that we kind of can smile and clink the glasses and have the sip and smile and feel that uncomfortable feeling if you really don't like alcohol anymore. And just know that, yeah, well, when I go to bed, I can lie there and go right back into the ocean. Tomorrow, as I'm driving home, I can be in the car listening to music back in the ocean. So there is no way to have, no one can steal the ocean, my friend. I promise you. It's never not going to be there. It's those footprints, though.
Right, because the thoughts that I was having over the last week were crazy.
Yeah, but celebrate that the tide is not the ocean,
Yeah,
but the tide is the weather. I mean,
yeah.
we
Well,
we're actually just standing on the beach like 20 minutes before you and I sat down to do this because of where we live. We drive down to the beach to have our cup of coffee. And I wish I would have recorded. Oh, my intuition told me to record it because I would want to play that sound right now of crashing huge wild waves off of the wild ocean onto the left coast of Canada, where the waves are so big that when they move away from the shore, they pull rocks, and the song of rocks banging against rocks is the infinity of the ocean versus the land and how sand is made over infinite time. That sound this morning, I'm salivating in a way on the inside with the gorgeousness of just embracing the impermanence of it all. But I'm going to go and record that sound. I'll maybe do it before we launch, or I'll put on this podcast and I'll put a sound of that. We all know what waves crashings sound like. Hearing the
hmm.
rocks tumble from a 15-foot crashing insane surf, washing the world away from the world, that's hauntingly beautiful. But that's also the ocean, because her job in a way is to pull apart all the stagnation and the big rocks of our lumpiness of identity. And that's why I was like having this beautiful moment with my partner. She's a yoga teacher, does a completely different system of Qigong, meditates for both of us, giving our lives and where we're at in our lives, just to like hold each other in that way of like, well, this is really the truth space here. Not because of the wave sound, because of the wave going away with all the clanking, cobbling, cacophony of stones singing their erosion back into the world, like, oh. Anyway, I'll stop getting about romantic poetry about surf and rocks, but
Well, I can't wait to hear
anyway,
the sound.
yeah, I'll bring it. I'll
Um,
get it.
yeah, yeah. I guess like it's really hard to not think that you've potentially made some mistakes by diving off the deep end in one of those directions, and that in some way you just fucked it all up. And that those footprints aren't going to be there because that was the hell that I had put myself through over the last week is like, oh no, I totally went off the deep end and I made choices and uh and now I don't even know if that ocean is there anymore. And funny enough, it is there. I'm feeling pretty good today.
Oh, I think you
Um,
got 28 hours of footprints in there. What's your phone say now?
uh, yeah, 28
There you go.
and 24
That,
minutes.
well, that's footprints, my friend. I kind of thinking you can always make more.
Hmm. Yeah, we can go. I guess we can go in either direction. It's not that, because funny enough, before this conversation, I had committed to the fact that I was just going to lock the door on everything and just go deep into my practice.
Yeah, you
And
could. You could.
I could, yeah, for a period of time, might not be a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm always as a writer, especially as a neurodivergent writer, I rail against the confines of normal use of grammar and writing and commas and brackets and spaces and things because there's layers of meaning that you can impart in the way we use documents nowadays that I find quite helpful. Um, but oh, I lost where I was going with that. Commas, parentheses, brackets.
Layers, documents.
Right. So there's a thing that I often will do between two things. I'll say, you can have this and or that, the and slash or, and a lot of the editing support programs or AIs now, like they're just like, that's bad grammar. People don't do that anymore. That's so 1950s or something. And I'm like, but I want people to consider the and relationship, consider the or relationship. Notice that both exist simultaneously and that's okay. And perhaps that might be really good in the context of this. Do we lock the door and not have coffee or cannabis or sex or connection because somehow it might take something away from practice? And there are contexts where that's true. And then there's contexts where and is also true and maybe significantly more beneficial at a certain time.
Mm-hmm.
Because especially when we're talking about practice in Qigong and how much it is a sensual homecoming to the like unbelievable I'm going to say menu, I suppose, or buffet of what could be experienced. And if we say I have that, or I have mundane life, including pleasure, sex, and going to a coffee shop once in a while. Okay, it's this or that.
Yeah, because what I'm learning is a lot of, well, I think I've knocked on every single one of those doors in the outer world, and it's like um they're satisfying, but they're not fulfilling. Like it's
Mhm.
like satisfying for like a few days, whereas just recently, even in my practice, I'm noticing, uh, oh, this is satisfying and fulfilling.
Mhm.
And there's really not anything in the world that'll compare to something like a real sensual, like beautiful devotional practice.
Yeah, and 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 is allowed.
It's allowed.
And sometimes, I mean, deep sigh. I sigh sometimes, along with many other people who've spent decades training with teachers, the misuse of what people think of as Taoist sexual alchemy or sacred intimacy and all the shenanigans and superpowers and sacred retreats and $10,000 initiations and creepy old, often very insecure men with small junk coercing other people into some paradigm of trickery to get laid by whoever they're trying to trick into trickery, right? That's always been a thing. It's always going to be a thing. Unfortunately, anything mystical and magical will always lure out I don't know, the predators and the prey of life in that way.
Sure.
There is some profoundly potent aspects of sacred intimacy that have a lot to do with Qigong practice. It's just very common sense. It's very much more about hygiene and um, honoring the autonomy of two people instead of just the practitioner. And that's a funny thing that's often jarring, like I don't know. My partner has this story about when she was working way up in the bush in northern Canada about driving along. I think it was a bat that flew into her windshield, and it landed right in front of her face on the windshield, and the face of it had this really comedic and terrifying facial expression as it splatted into the windshield. And for some reason that's just become like a meme in our relationship of like we just sort of like make that thing of like, yeah, it's like seeing the face of that bat slap up against like causality because sometimes it's life has moments where you slam into the windshield of no or limits.
Hmm.
So I think when it comes to that, I mean, I just wanted to make that moment echo for the people listening to this who think if you think sacred sexual intimacy as a practice is just about what you get and what you do and what it's like for you, splat. It's about two people sharing a whole unraveling of unknown possibilities in an encounter that you play with in a context.
Hmm.
We have the three selves, the Di Dao, Sa Dao, sorry, the three Dao, the Dao soil, Dao beings, Dao, the what's coming down from the sky or heaven, if you want to go there. So you even need, I mean, that's sort of the first step of sacred intimacy is what happens within the animal body interaction, what happens between two selves selfing in intimacy, what happens in the more esoteric, existential, deep why of intimacy, which kind of transcends romantic thinking. So when we're thinking of the and, let's just and, and, and maybe an and with a question mark, and.
Mm.
So when you're going into the sacredness of, well, I have my practice, I have my cultivation, I have my commitments, maybe I have a schedule, a tradition, maybe an outcome, maybe whatever enlightenment might be for, as a thing we aspire to, why not? And then we have an and with another person. Or maybe, we enjoy cannabis, or maybe we enjoy other things. Is there a way that that and can work? And with some things, maybe, and some things maybe not, depending on what you're cultivating.
Hmm.
Right. And I know we are talking about fasting. We're just talking about fasting in the context of the answer is a pendulum. The answer is yin yang. So if we're going to be going more into, like, say, the physiology and the benefits and the other whys, the spiritual whys, the deeper context of fasting in that way, that's an abstinence. It seems to be healthy that we should swing that pendulum all the way to the middle and then all the way to where and can go. Not necessarily in some Roman end of the Roman Empire freak show of like just gobbling every drug and consuming every substance and thing to it's like Homer Simpson on really bad acid or something. I mean, maybe that works for somebody. I'm not the arbiter of what works for anyone else. I'm just suggesting that that pendulum be a part of our skill set because fasting asks us 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 days of no, of maybe or let's maybe with a bit of self-care after the fasting, hurt yourself, swing that pendulum back the other way. And know that this is your cultivation. It is a pendulum of yin yang
Mm.
that keeps all aspects of your life going. Because otherwise, we're just door locking hermits who are missing something. And believe me, I've defaulted on the autistic spectrum to I'll just live alone. Believe me, it's so much easier for people like me. Neurodivergence isn't a cakewalk, and other people are a lot to deal with, especially after a day of, say, 20 patients or something. So I'm just
Yeah.
saying that from like I get what the or mind is because I've swung it
Hmm.
back and forth, and I don't recommend abstinence um, for more than 10 years at a time. And maybe hold that 10 years at a time of your life where abstinence doesn't suck. Like even my teacher, like when I have quite a few different teachers, but my main teacher in the lineage sense, like he as a doctor said, probably the best thing for the world is for me to do this 10 years after I retire, which he did. He actually locked himself, didn't literally lock himself into his basement, but he cloistered himself away from all of the needs of all of his students and patients and people for what he thought was the 10 years of his life. And he got 13 years to be in that place, which, uh, I'm sure he got where he needed to go.
So in that context, abstinence would be like abstaining from all things.
Well, the or things.
Mm.
I mean, he was what in his 80s then. So,
Um, yeah, I just have a question for yourself in your cultivation journey, which has been quite a few years. Um, how you probably had moments where you really did focus on abstaining and
oh
really
yeah.
following the path. Like how long were those chunks of time? Did
The
Because I know
longest I
there's like
fast.
100 days, right? Because I know there's like 100 days of like practice and stuff.
Well, I've done that many times. Usually 100 days is about this practice. Like there's
Hmm.
100 days of maybe just I'm going to practice every day, but usually with the 100-day tradition, it's a training deeper into, say, Qigong form, standing meditation, a certain kind of Tai Chi, 4 hours a day practice. So it's like yeah, what we think of as forging something in the metallurgy sense. So there's that
Oh,
refinement of taking a thing and transforming a thing into a slightly more refined thing. Whereas abstinence is removing something for a period of time to discover what your experience is without that perhaps cloying, numbing, uh, deflating thing. I mean, sex is awesome. Don't recommend abstaining from that for your whole life or for really extended periods of time unless for some reason that's just a need. Um, because that's a reunion. There's a refinement of all kinds of imbalances there. Maybe we should do an episode on sacred intimacy just to, lay all that out there. But to answer your question, I've done many 100 days, but that's about a specific element of training. I fast consistently 4 days, at least every year, sometimes twice a year, and 10 years every time, or 10 days. I'll do a 10-day fast every time I really need to reorient something deeper. And 10 days, man, with breath work, and especially in a dark like situation where you have like the blackout blinds and you're in dark light on purpose, which is also a Taoist avenue to the DMT flashes you get from ayahuasca. There's lots of ways to get your
Wow.
pineal gland to say, let's see what the ancestors do when they're dancing in front of you, and colors you didn't know existed in the inside of your mind, So there's that stuff. I've done 2 year celibate retreats, partially out of just being a grumpy solo autistic person who gets tired and bored of the cheese grater component of relationality and relative maturity within peers and interests, and also perhaps being a relatively famous person in a small town. You have a really, for myself, it's conspired ethically around like everyone's your patient and your student, so you should probably take some time and wait till new people start coming into your town so that you can, find other opportunities and stuff. So I mean, I don't know. For me, sometimes I just find for myself, and maybe I just have a little lower sex drive, where I've transmuted my sexual energy into something else, or whatever the story needs to be. I don't really need it to be a story. I've delighted in knowing, for the next couple of years, I'm just going to be in this space, and it's just such for me. And again, I have maybe some slightly different wiring in the way my physical neurology works that makes me very happy with less is more sometimes. But I wouldn't want that to be forever. It's just until I finish the thing I wanted to do in that context, environment, well, realm of opportunities and distractions and attractions. Because it's just, there's a solidity in the warriorship of yes to, no to, within a contained period
Hmm.
of time of alchemic work. To lock that door down and just say, I'm a celibate person. I'm now grumpy, scowly, and uncomfortable and irritable and pissed off most of the time because I'm physiologically have really taken this way too seriously and myself way too seriously. Because when I meet people who are often in that way, they're often the really bitter, fragile practitioners. They're not the happy, gregarious, fulfilling, um, what's that word? Gumption. They've just kind of withered in a way.
Mm.
So, I mean, there's good ideas, and then there's taking good ideas to the point where they become not so good ideas.
Yeah, because I think on one level it's coming from a place of devotion, and
Hmm.
the other one is coming from a place of like, I guess, warding off. It's just like no to this.
Yeah, control, bitterness,
Yeah.
insecurity, defeat. So it
Cool.
can go a lot of ways. But yeah, for me, the devotional commitment thing is huge because then you know that to be true of the one you are,
Hmm.
which allows a different immediate sense of commitment. Maybe just because I guess I want to speak to a couple of things that are the really juicy things. Excuse me. Do you know the word liminal? Do you use that much? Do you
Hmm.
mind kind of defining that? Just because I'd be curious where that sits for you.
So the first thing that comes to mind is just jumping off the diving board.
Hmm.
So liminal space would be like a space of transformation. So it's kind of like jumping off of, in this context, it would be uh kind of like who you think you are into like the unknown,
Hmm.
and then
Yeah,
allowing that to do what it does.
yeah. So yeah, the diving board thing probably my favorite like visual analogy for that. Because if you're afraid of heights, if you're afraid of water, diving off of a diving board is the one thing that sh- like that is the rite of passage for that
Hmm.
condition. And I often describe a person, standing on the diving board, then sitting on the diving board, then hanging off their white knuckled fingertips of the diving board before they let go. And the context being the one holding on is not the same person as the one who chooses eventually to let go. And that liminal moment is the transition between the one who can't let go and the one who can,
Hmm.
right? But interestingly, the term liminal, because Mike's a nerd and likes words, it means to shed new light, like new, not new light as light you've seen before, but a new volume or intensity or color or nature or spirit of light, because light and spirit and in a way are kind of interchangeable in the sense of spiritual luminosity. Like people glow who are lit up on the inside.
Hmm.
So we can all just decide that we're somehow magically fireflies and can generate like spiritual luminosity, or we all have to go, yeah, well, I should probably do a thing like meditate and practice and train and maybe have a system and a teacher and a tradition. And oh, that's how spiritual luminosity is developed. You can't just go and buy it at Walmart. Well, no, I'm sure you can now because some AI is listening to this going like, hey, that's a good idea. New product line. You too can glow in the dark.
Glow in the dark,
Um,
yeah.
right. So when we think of that new light, to shed new understanding, to shed new awareness, to shed, to ward off, to cast off the old, the husk, the brittle, the withered, the defeated, the insecure. Like at a certain point, we have to come from something innately alive within ourselves. And the way we
Hmm.
do that is through liminal challenges. You can't get to liminality because I just got it. You have to go and jump off diving boards or fast for 10 days or 4 days or some number of days or um, do a thing that's never been done because that's what new light comes from is never been done until the actual undoing of the doing. Yo way, wu way.
Hmm.
I guess I'm just trying to anchor this in Taoist terms. I'm sure people are like, is this a Taoist podcast?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So if we have this idea of liminality, and then we have the awareness that this is about state shift, and there's state shift in the moment, and there's state shift in the practice, and there's state shift in the narrowing. Often we talk about like the narrow passes in more advanced practice. To go through that is going to require a change, but it's also going to call on us something, and maybe I think of it as like a triad of some things. One is a yearning to pass the difficult pass. Or why bother, man? Turn around. Like if there's no meaning in the sense of I'm gonna spend 4 hours a day for 100 days or whatever it might be, without yearning and a quality of kind of yielding into where the yearning goes. What? What? Who? Like really? This means, well, I'll just sit, chill. I mean, this is the flaw of modern meditation. There's not even a warm up anymore. You just sit down and I'm just gonna sit and now I'm meditating. I would defy that to be true because I think meditation has like a lot of yearning, a lot of warm up, a lot of how-tos, a lot of getting certain things going. If it's going to be a career of redefining liminally what it is to be existence, right?
Hmm.
But I mean, now we have this psychotherapeutic quality of meditation, of insight meditation, of mindfulness meditation, of just sit. Observe your thoughts. Try not to have an extra thought about each thought until at least you can be in the sort of stream with leaves on top, going by you. Oh, the stream is the mind and it's moving and through time, and the leaf is a thought, and there's a stick and a thing, and oh my God, I don't like that memory. And ooh, that's a pretty memory. So we sit there and try not to have an opinion about the memories and the thoughts as they arise. And that's super important in the sense of being familiar with what consciousness does with itself. But you're just going to spend your entire meditation career, if it's meant to go somewhere, just sitting at the edge of the river, watching the river or the stream with things floating on it. And if you don't reach in there and start maybe pulling the leaves out and actually, in a sacred way, transforming what it is that they keep coming back up in your mind to help you with, you're just like, it's like, I've never been to, if you go to Japan, they have these sushi restaurants where there's like a conveyor belt that just goes around and around and around. There's like random stuff you can take, and then they'll actually make you your thing and it'll come right in front of you. And like
Yeah.
at some point, you're actually at the buffet to eat a meal and grow and learn and heal. You're not just sitting there to watch the food or the story or the relentlessness of the mind go by.
Hmm.
It's a practice implies an outcome of some kind, even if it's just one less leaf a year, or whatever it might be, one less traumatic memory a year that kind of owns your spine. So there's a yearning that's it's necessary. And then there's the sacrifice, the sacredness, the I will actually commit to being changed by my practice, by my ayahuasca, by my person, doing the Reiki to the back of my, nervous system, like whatever I'm yearning for. I am aware that I'm going to have to go through something of sacrifice. Oh, wait, fasting does both. Good, good idea. The third thing in the sense of what makes our spiritual practice practicable, teachable, applicable, like in outcomeable in the context in which outcome means something. Obviously, there's the whole other side of the conversation. Then there's this other thing, which is intensity. So I'm going to shift topics quickly because you're one person I know who has a certain experience. So a few months ago, when I first moved to this part of Canada, you came to a martial arts workshop. I
I
think it was
did,
just
yeah.
like a few hours. And because of the stuff I teach being primarily like tactical combatives, violence oriented, not uh, a traditional martial art or play fighting kind of context. What would you say your experience of the intensity of what we were playing with meant?
Um, like life or death,
Yeah.
like really intense. Broke my
Well,
scale.
yeah. It what? It what?
Broke my scale.
What does that mean?
Just well, in like that level of intensity, it literally it broke something inside of me. And I could share that experience. I don't know if I shared that with you.
Please. No, no, I
Um,
want I love that term broke my scale. I just want you to like I'm salivating now. Feed me your buffet. Tell me what's
the very interesting thing is like most of my life I've been pretty insecure and not knowing what to do in a situation of violence. And just the two or three things that was learned that was very tactically precise and giving me kind of like a framework of like, hey, this is what you should do if you're ever in a life or death situation. What I noticed is I had this like ball in my solar plexus like forever. And after those 3 hours, it just unwound and literally flew into the universe. And I could breathe better. I felt different. And so yeah, it broke a condition inside of me just knowing that information of like that seriousness of violence as opposed
yeah.
to it just being a big unknown.
Yeah, and you're the only one who could do that for you because you stood your ground and maintained the like coherence of step, step, step. Like this is how it's like a math problem. There's a sequence to violence, and if you can hold that space and just stick with it, that's how it's going to work. It's like the opposite of rocket science. But you have
It's
to,
fascinating.
but it is that thing. And that's why I bring up that context is the intensity of our yes. is the only way we get to know, K-N-O-W, how effective we can be at saying no, like the N-O no, the negating no. If I don't have a visceral yes, visceral no's will defeat me. In the sense of,
Mm,
I should say no to, I don't know, smoking a joint. And I have this visceral sense of boredom and loneliness. I have no experience of a visceral yes. So what happens?
mm,
An hour into the boredom and loneliness, I'm sparking up the joint. So it's getting to that part of our sense of being. And I know this is a hard conversation for a whole bunch of people who might be listening to this because we have an affirmation of softness, of yielding, of opening, of the infinite feminine, right? And then because we identify the mother with safety, the mother with nourishing, the mother with support, protection. Well, dad does protection too, but mom does this other thing that's a bit more mama bear, which is a bit scarier than dad. But we somehow kind of want to hold on to mama's like the lap and the breast and the soup and what to do when you have a, I don't want to go to school today, mom, because I'm sick. So we hold a certain need there. But again, just sharing what I was sharing about standing at the ocean this morning, Mama Bear, the ocean, the great mother, is what wears the substance of the world from the form back into the formless. She's not messing around. She's going to turn the entire physical world into sand. That's the job, in the sense of how you could like give the ocean as tide, as spirit and meaning. There's all the
mm-hmm.
happy positives and how fun surfing can be and the crashing undulations of good sex. And then it's like, oh yeah, she's going to wear us down to sand. Maybe the forming of form isn't really the job here because this great protective, soft, embracing mama is also Mama Bear, and she wants you to become this one of not a little special bauble, you know. So there's an intensity of nature that sometimes we want to meet in our practice, not because we're against something, it's that we're for something beyond the something we are. And the way I describe alchemic practice is beyond a profound undoing. You don't get profound undoings or beyond profound undoings without being profoundly focused on doing something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the intensity, there's the yearning, there's whatever we contextualize as individuals in our own lives are sacrificing. We all have trauma response. We all have trauma soothing response. Can you sacrifice your soothing response enough to hold space for what's actually underneath of it, which is the pain, the boredom, the ennui, all the words for why are we here?
And all the pains from all the things that we've experienced.
Yeah. Do you have an answer to that these days? Why are we here?
Mm. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is to play.
Yeah, play, and then there's love, there's compassion, there's the serious version of insight or enlightenment or reunion, which is pretty black and white for some people.
And then on the other level is kind of like to, I think what you've said before is like, let's just leave our soul cleaner than we found it.
Yeah. Or my favorite one in this context is, do you mind asking that question?
Hey, Mike, why are we here?
Why not? It's as complicated as it needs to be. Why not? Like, why not? And since we're here and we're in a somewhat distracting, comfort-seeking, infinite buffet of stimulation and distraction and stuffing and repressing and all of that, why not do the opposite of that? And now we're set up to have a conversation about fasting. Since I'm a professor of clinical medicine, what would you like to know about fasting, Rabbi?
Thank you for exploring and enjoying Primordial Tao, Present Tao. We look forward to sharing more in the next episode.